Welcome back, folks. I'm Frizz, and today we're going to be talking about the diplomacy skill and how it's been implemented into Pathfinder 2e. Diplomacy is the skill that you use whenever you're trying to be nice to someone, and it is probably the most commonly used face skill in the entire game, although of course that will depend on how your character talks to people. If you're trying to remotely be persuasive or nice, diplomacy skill is the most valuable face skill in the game, and it obviously uses charisma. Without further ado, let's just start talking about how attitudes work, because we really need to cover those first before we talk about the actual rules as written uses for diplomacy and the skill feats. So first, indifferent means that someone doesn't care about you either way, and most NPCs are going to be starting off as indifferent unless you have a reputation that precedes you. Friendly is the minor version of the positive attitude. It's that they think that you're probably a good person, but they're not going to be sticking out their neck for you because they don't really know you all that well. Helpful represents a NPC that is actively willing and wanting to help you and will be trying to do whatever they can to help out your requests. An unfriendly attitude means that they dislike you and they don't want to help you and just want you to get out of their life. Hostile is the step above that though, where they actively work against you and they might just straight up attack you because of their dislike. Now, this doesn't mean that they're just going to be breaking the law to attack you. They're not homicidal because they're hostile, but it might mean that they are going to be falsely reporting to the guards that they saw you doing something. This is generally the stage of attitude that you really want to avoid if you can, because someone being hostile can be a big problem. Without further ado, let's start talking about exactly what it is that diplomacy allows you to do. So, the most common use for diplomacy is also the only use for diplomacy that is actually untrained, and that is to gather information. Gathering information is something that you can do outside of combat, where you go around and you just talk to people in taverns or markets or just general gathering places to try and learn about a specific individual or topic. The GM, of course, decides the DC of that check in secret and how long it takes, but generally it's going to take 2 hours. And along with any kind of additional bonuses that you might get for how you act. Like, if you are paying people money, you're probably going to have an easier time getting information from them because everyone likes to get paid for their knowledge. Additionally, the check that you make, which is of course against a DC that the GM determines, is secret, meaning that you don't know the result of your roll, which is pretty important because if you get a success, then you get information about the topic, but if you critically fail, you get incorrect information about the topic. Gathering information is not all that complicated really, as it should be. You're just going around talking to people, but it is a pretty important part of how you can effectively think of this as recalling knowledge, but you use diplomacy and a significantly more time. It's just, what are people talking about a specific person? Making an impression is honestly the most common use, I would say, of diplomacy, and it is very simple. Whenever you talk to someone for at least 1 minute, you can then try and make a good impression on them, so long as you were actually, being nice to them while you were talking to them. At the end of the conversation, you attempt a diplomacy check against the will DC of one person that you were talking to, modified by any kind of circumstance bonuses that the GM decides to add. Like, if you were actually nice to them, then you probably get a bonus. But if you did something that's incredibly disrespectful in their culture, then you're probably going to get a penalty. Any good impressions or bad impressions that you get on a critical failure only last for this current social interaction, but the GM can decide to do otherwise if you are particularly nice. I like it I generally like this a bit more if the impressions last a bit longer, because that makes the role feel significantly more impactful as a player, but I understand if you critically succeed, then maybe over time you don't get the full success of that, but there's just a bit there, because it makes the conversation feel like it actually has a lasting impact. But anyway, if you get a success against the target's will DC, their attitude towards you improves by 1 step and 2 steps on a critical success. but if you critically fail, then their attitude towards you decreases by a step. So, generally speaking, really try not to critically fail, because obviously getting someone to be upset with you is never a good thing. The last rules as written use for the diplomacy skill is making a request. Making a request actually only takes a single action, so you can actually use this in combat, where you then make a request of a creature that is friendly or helpful to you. You have to actually say the request in terms that the target would accept, because you can't exactly say, "Die for me," because that isn't going to be something that people are going to accept. But you could say, "Hey, I'm being chased by someone, can you unlock the door and let me inside?" That is substantially more likely for people to actually, let you in. GM decides the DC based off of the difficulty of the request, so some are going to be impossible to do even if someone is helpful to you, because, simply put, people don't want to just jump into the middle of a fight with a dragon just because you asked them nicely. If you critically succeed against whatever DC the GM decides, then the target agrees to your request without any kind of issue. If you succeed, the target agrees to your request, but they might, try and alter it a bit or only do some of what you asked. If you fail, then they just refuse to do whatever you asked, though they might propose an alternative that is less extreme. So, yeah, it could be something where like, "Hey, I'm not going to let you inside my house because you're being chased by the guard, but I will give you an alibi." Critically failing is substantially worse, because not only do they refuse to do what you ask, their attitude towards you decreases by 1 due to the insanity of what you just asked. My favorite part about this entire action is that directly into it, it's basically said, yeah, diplomacy isn't mind control. You can ask people to do whatever you want, but no matter what you roll, some things are just going to be impossible. You can't tell people what to do just because you have a good diplomacy. You actually have to be diplomatic. What a shock. Let's start talking about skill feats, because diplomacy has a fair amount of them. The first one is a level 1 skill feat called Bargain Hunter, which requires that you're trained in diplomacy, and then it allows you to use diplomacy to earn income by spending your day hunting for bargains, and then reselling whatever you buy at a profit. So you're not actually, buying anything or producing anything of value, but instead you're moving around goods and making additional money from it. You can also now try to spend time specifically looking for a good bargain on a particular item. This works as if you were using earn income with diplomacy, but instead of actually getting money, you take the money that you would get and then discount that amount from a particular item that you're trying to buy. And if you do this enough to where you reduce the item's price to 0, you get it for free. Also, if you get Bargain Hunter at level 1, then you start the game with an additional 2 gold, so 17, because level 1 characters have 15 gold normally. I believe the only way to actually get this at level 1 is if you have the merchant background, but it's still pretty okay. I mean, 2 gold isn't all that much, and you will very quickly get that much gold just by playing the game, as long as your GM is giving you the correct amount of gold, but it's still okay. Being able to earn income with diplomacy is certainly a fun option that is representative of a lot of characters. The Bon Mot skill feat is incredibly good, and honestly, I feel like it's one of the best skill feats in the entire game. It only requires that you're trained in diplomacy, and then for one action, you can launch a quip at a foe, which distracts them. You have to choose someone within 30 feet, and then you roll a diplomacy check against their will DC. On a success, they take a -2 status penalty to perception and will saves for a whole minute, but the target can end this early if they respond to your quip. This is going to be an action that has the concentrate trait or an appropriate skill action to frame that retort. So it could be something where they just concentrate, think, okay, that was a really stupid pun, I'm not gonna let it bother me. Or they can try and insult you back with a single, they roll intimidate, they say, hey, fuck you, that was a terrible pun, they no longer have the penalty. GM decides what actions qualify for it, but they generally have to spend at least one action. Typically, this retort does need to be some kind of linguistic, charisma-based skill action, so they can't, like, flex at you with athletics to get rid of the bon mot penalty, but if the GM decides that that'd be fun, yeah, you can absolutely do it. If you get a critical success rather than a success, the penalty is a -3 instead, which is of course way better. If you critically fail, then your quip is absolutely terrible. You take the same penalty that an enemy would have taken as if you had succeeded, so a -2 to perception and will saves. This lasts after 1 minute, or until you use another bon mot and you actually succeed. Now, bon mot, I feel, is absolutely incredible, and the reason why I think that it's absolutely incredible is because it works so well with spellcasters. Like, spellcasters generally will have a lot of effects that require will saves, and being able to apply a -2 or -3 penalty to someone will really help out your spellcaster buddies, and bon mot is in general a fantastic way to spend your third action. Say, you attack and then you attack again, and then what do you do with your third action? You just make stupid puns, and it has mechanical benefits. The one downside of this feat that you should keep in mind, though, is that it has the auditory, emotion, linguistic, and mental traits. This means that a lot of creatures are going to be immune to it, and it is limited by what languages you speak. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't make the skill feat bad, but it does limit it, which is good. So earlier when I was talking about the make an impression action, you probably noticed that you can only use make an impression on one person at a time, which is okay, but it does mean that you're going to be pretty limited in social situations. The group impression feat is what you need to take if you want to apply make an impression to more people. Whenever you take it, you can compare your diplomacy check against the will DCs of 2 different targets instead of 1. It's also possible to get different degrees of success for each target, so if you just weren't aware that one person that you were talking to was level 20 and one was level 1, you're almost certainly going to have different degrees of success for both targets. Also, as your proficiency increases with diplomacy, the amount of people that you can influence at a single time increases. So you can influence 4 people at a time if you're an expert, 10 people at a time if you're a master, and 25 if you're legendary. Now, I don't know how often you'll actually be influencing 25 important people and like significant NPCs at once, but if it comes up, then yeah, this is amazing. The Hobnubber skill feat is one of the funniest sounding skill feats, but it's also pretty good, especially if you use gather information frequently. Generally, gather information will take about 2 hours, but with Hobnubber, you are exceptionally good at actually talking to people and getting people to say what you want them to say. So you take half as much time as normal whenever you use gather information. This generally is going to reduce it to 1 hour. If you're a master in diplomacy, and you choose to gather information at the normal speed that everyone else can do it, then whenever you do it and you roll a critical failure, you instead get a normal failure. This means that you aren't going to be getting objectively false information for critically failing. Unfortunately, this feat doesn't actually make it impossible for you to get false information, though, since if you're trying to gather information on something that just the only information about it is a false rumor, then you learn the false rumor, but you don't necessarily learn that it's wrong. So, effectively, if you try and gather information on the secret rules of a secret society that nobody knows, you're just gonna get rumors. So don't always assume that everything you learn is correct. The no cause for alarm feat is actually one of the only diplomacy skill feats that is useful in combat outside of bon mot, and it is pretty good, though it does take all 3 of your actions on a turn. Whenever you use this, you spend all 3 actions, and then you try and reduce how frightened all of your allies are within 10 feet of you. You speak a bunch of reassuring words, and then you make a diplomacy check against the will DC of all creatures within a 10-foot emanation of you. Each of the creatures who is then impacted by this is temporarily immune for 1 hour. On a success against their will DC, you reduce their frightened value by 1, and on a critical success, you reduce their frightened value by 2. This is pretty good, as frightened is very, very annoying and can come up pretty frequently, so yeah, it's pretty nice. Discreet inquiry is actually a deception or diplomacy skill feat that you can take at level 2. And it means that you're incredibly good at hiding what you're actually looking for whenever you're asking questions. Whenever you're gathering information, you can hide the true subject of whatever you're asking about among a bunch of other topics that don't really matter. Whenever anyone tries to gather information to determine what you were talking about, they have to exceed your deception DC or the normal DC for gathering information about your inquiries, whichever is higher, or else they actually don't learn about your efforts. So effectively, gathering information about you and exactly what you were doing is harder because you hide it amongst a lot of other stuff. This is basically just social stealth. The Glad Hand skill feat makes first impressions truly your specialty. Whenever you meet anyone in a casual or social situation, you can immediately attempt a diplomacy check to make an impression on that creature rather than having to actually talk to them for a minute. You take a -5 penalty on this check, but if you fail or critically fail due to that -5 or just in general, you can still engage in 1 minute of conversation with them and attempt a new check at the end of that time rather than accepting the failure or critical failure result. This basically means that you have 2 chances to make an impression on someone, and one of them, it has a -5 penalty, which is a pretty huge penalty for 2E, but it still can make a ton of fights just resolve like a snap, and just really cool down tensions. And if you combine this with the group impression skill feat, you can impact a lot of people in a very short amount of time. Starting off, the master levels skill feats for diplomacy, Evangelize is honestly hilarious. To be able to take it, you have to follow a deity or particular, philosophy, and you have to be a master in diplomacy. But then for one action with the auditory, linguistic, and mental traits, you can try and point out a singular detail that really just supports your faith and messes up another one's. You attempt a diplomacy check and compare the result to the will DC of a single target that can hear you and understands whatever language you're speaking, and then that target is then temporarily immune to evangelize in respect to your specific deity or philosophy for 1 day. If you try and use evangelize on someone who already agrees with you, they are unaffected because you pointing out how good your religion is doesn't exactly have the same effects on someone who already believes the same thing as you. Also, if you use evangelize on someone and then they genuinely change their perspective, they are also unaffected because they now agree with you. Regardless of all of that stuff, if you critically succeed, then the target is stupefied 2 for 1 round. And if you get a success, the target is stupefied 1 for 1 round. If you fail, then nothing happens, but this is just honestly one of the easiest ways I can think of to consistently apply the stupefied condition to an enemy, and being able to do that is pretty nice. I mean, I can't help but compare this with Bon Mot, because both of them are single action diplomacy actions that apply a penalty to a target's will save. But Evangelize is pretty much better, because while the penalty is actually smaller, because on a success, Evangelize applies stupefied 1, while on a success, Bon Mot applies a -2 penalty on will saves and perception checks, Evangelize is stupefied. That means that it also reduces their save DCs, which, of their spells, which on a spellcaster is great. So Evangelize is a nice thing to have in your back pocket. It might not always be useful. It is substantially better if you have spellcasters in your party that like casting spells that require will saves, but it isn't anything stupidly good. However, it is stupidly good, roleplay wise, because it's just hilarious. The Shameless Request feat is pretty funny, actually, because it is a level 7 skill feat that requires that you're master in diplomacy, and whenever you take it, you can now downplay the consequences or simply how outrageous your requests are by just how brazen and charming you are. Whenever you request something, you reduce any DC increases for making an outrageous request by 2, and if you roll a critical failure on your request, you get a failure instead. This means that generally you can never reduce a target's attitude by making a request, but just as if these people are real people. If someone continues to ask you to do something over and over and over and over again, they're going to get tired of you even if they still have a positive, opinion of you. So don't try and request something of someone over and over and over and over again until you roll well. It isn't really going to work, and even if you're charming, you still have to worry about being annoying. Now, this is pretty good, but keep in mind that this does not just reduce the DC for making a request. This reduces any DC increases due to making an outrageous request. So if the GM decides, you know what, asking what you're asking is going to be harder than asking someone to do something pretty normal, so I'm going to increase the DC a little bit, you reduce that increase, not the actual DC to every request that you make. It's still pretty good, but it is a bit more situational, but it fits particular characters fantastically. Diplomacy only has access to a single legendary skill feat, and that is Legendary Negotiation. Normally, since this skill feat exists, it's presumed to be impossible to just spend an action in combat to try and stop combat peacefully. But once you have Legendary Negotiation, you can spend 3 actions to absurdly fast negotiate end to violence. You attempt to make an impression of a single creature, and then you make a request of them to stop whatever violence they're currently doing, and then to try and talk things out further. You take a -5 penalty on your diplomacy checks, and the GM sets the DC of the request based on the circumstances. It is generally going to be at least a very hard DC of the creature's level, not your level, and some creatures are just going to simply refuse, and even those who agree to it may ultimately find whatever you're trying to, whatever argument you're making is going to be lacking and then try to kill you anyway. But the important part is that this gives you a chance. This means that you can try and talk your way out of every single fight that you get into. But do keep in mind that making an impression and making a request requires that you speak a language with someone. So if you're talking to an animal, Legendary Negotiation probably isn't going to work very well, because they can't exactly understand what you're saying, and some creatures are just going to completely ignore you and try to kill you anyway. The only problem that I have with this feat is something that I alluded to a bit earlier, which is that because this feat exists, it's kind of presumed that you can't even attempt this without this feat, meaning that you can't talk your way out of any fight normally. However, I feel like that's kind of lame, and GMs are just going to allow you to do this sort of stuff. Normally, it's just going to be harder. I really like the diplomacy skill. I feel like it's been implemented very well in 2e, and I love how it actually includes in the actual rules and description of the actions that you can't get people to do what they don't want to do. You simply change their impressions of you, but they still have full agency in all their decisions. Diplomacy isn't mind control, which is a perception that I feel like a lot of people may get whenever they're dealing with NPCs of, oh, but I rolled a 20, so therefore whatever I'm asking of this person should happen. And that simply isn't the case, rules as written, and I think rules as intended. I generally like the way that's been implemented. I don't really know how often people will use the make an impression and make a request rules in normal games, because to be honest, you can kind of just say, oh, I rolled well on my diplomacy check, that's probably good enough to make an impression based on what you said. So it's not always something that's going to be used by the book, but it is still a great framework to base whatever ruling you're going to be using in your game off of. Overall, I just really like the way that face skills have been implemented in 2e, and they just make sense, and yeah. That's exactly what you need, is a good framework for a good roleplay system, because a bunch of rules don't really work great for roleplay and kind of just add additional bits in there that overcomplicate things. And I really, really don't think that diplomacy is overcomplicated in 2e. So yeah. Thanks for making it to the end of this video. I hope that this video isn't any worse than usual. I know that it's a bit weird because traditionally on this channel I've been releasing archetype reviews every single Saturday, and shockingly, diplomacy is not a archetype, so it's probably a little bit weird to see that there's not an archetype review today. And the reason for that is because archetype reviews generally take me a bit longer to make. They require a bit more research. They're generally a bit more weird. So I don't have a lot of time this week to do that. And I might just be switching to doing more mechanical sort of videos on Saturdays and then releasing more opinion pieces on Thursdays. My schedule has shifted a lot over the past month or so, so I have a lot less time to work on stuff now. So I hope that this is still good. I hope that you guys still like it. And if you have any suggestions on things that I could do to make this better, I would love it. This video, I literally didn't script anything. I just had the feats open and then I decided to talk about them because I am exhausted and I don't have the energy to actually script everything. So I hope that you guys have had a good week. I know that it's been a long one, and until I see you next, live a wonderful life.